She asked only for a roof to shield her through the night, her voice carrying the weight of exhaustion and fear. But when the cowboy opened his door and his heart, offering not just shelter but a lifetime by his side, it left one question: was this mercy alone, or the beginning of forever? The wind howled through the valley of Raven's Hollow, rattling the loose boards on the porch of Elias Cade's ranch house. Midnight storms weren't unusual out here, but tonight's rain carried a bite, the kind that slashed sideways and turned the dirt road into a twisting river of mud. Inside, Elias stirred the embers of his fire, grateful for the solitude. Nights like these kept people away, and solitude was a companion he trusted more than most men. But then came the knock. It wasn't timid. It wasn't bold. Just 3 steady raps that seemed to echo through the silence between thunderclaps. Elias froze, his hand tightening on the iron poker. Folks didn't ride to a man's door at this hour unless they were desperate or dangerous. He opened the door with caution, the storm rushing in around the frame, and there she stood. A woman, soaked through to her bones, hair plastered against her pale face, eyes wide with a mix of fear and exhaustion. She clutched a small bundle to her chest, not a child, but a worn satchel, as if it were the last thing she owned in the world. "I need," her voice trembled, "just one night, a roof. Then I'll be gone by morning." Elias studied her in silence. Years of ranching had taught him to read storms, those in the sky and those in people's eyes. Hers told a story of someone who had run too far, too fast, with nowhere left to go. He could have turned her away. Lord knew it would have been easier. But something in him shifted, the part of his heart that had been locked up since the day he buried his wife beneath the cottonwoods. Against his better judgment, he stepped back. "Come in before you freeze solid," he said. She hesitated, as if afraid the invitation might vanish. Then she crossed the threshold, dripping rain onto his wooden floor. Elias shut the door behind her. The storm muffled instantly, leaving only the hiss of the fire. "Name?" he asked. Her lips parted, uncertain, before she whispered, "Seraphine Vale." It was a name that carried an old-world weight, fragile yet sharp, and he found himself repeating it in his mind. Seraphine. She looked ready to collapse, and for a moment, Elias wondered how long she'd been walking that storm-lashed road. He pointed to the fire. "Warm yourself. I'll fetch a blanket." Seraphine obeyed, sinking to her knees before the hearth. The flames painted her face in flickering light, and Elias noticed her hands small, trembling, scarred in places that told of hard labor and harsher treatment. Whoever she was, she hadn't been living easy. As thunder rolled across the hollow, Elias draped a wool blanket over her shoulders. She murmured thanks, clutching it tight, her eyes glassy but unbroken. "One night," she'd said. "One night of shelter." Elias Cade had no idea yet that the choice he made at midnight would change every night to come. Before we carry on, what would you have done if someone like Seraphine knocked on your door in the middle of a storm? Let me know down below. Morning broke gray and quiet over Raven's Hollow, the storm spent but leaving behind a world washed clean. Elias Cade rose early, as he always did, though his routine felt unsettled by the fact that a stranger slept under his roof. He lingered by the stove, pouring black coffee into a tin cup, the steam curling upward as he listened for the sound of her stirring. When Seraphine finally emerged, she moved carefully, as if afraid to disturb the silence of the house. Her wet clothes from the night before had been laid near the fire, stiff now but drying. She wore a faded dress that hung a little too loose on her frame, the blanket still draped across her shoulders. "You should eat," Elias said, gesturing to the skillet on the stove. Bacon sizzled quietly, filling the cabin with its rich scent. Her eyes flicked toward it, then back to him, suspicion shadowing her gratitude. "I don't want to trouble you. I only meant to stay the night." Elias leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable beneath his rugged features. The storm didn't leave you much choice. You look like you've been walking for miles." She lowered her gaze, fingers tightening on the edge of the blanket. He didn't press her further. He knew the look of someone carrying secrets too heavy to name. Instead, he reached for a second plate, setting it across the table. "Sit. No sense leaving hungry." For a long moment she hesitated, then obeyed, sliding into the chair with the caution of a guest who believed kindness had strings attached. Elias placed a plate before her: eggs, bacon, and bread, thickly sliced from yesterday's loaf. She murmured thanks so softly it was nearly lost in the crackle of the stove. As she ate, her eyes traveled to the cabin's interior. Every wall spoke of a life lived alone: simple shelves, tools neatly hung, a rifle above the mantel. But one door remained shut, its frame worn smooth from years of use and then years of disuse. Her gaze lingered there longer than she intended. Elias noticed. "That room." He paused, jaw tightening. "It was my wife's. Haven't opened it since she passed." Seraphine's fork still. She swallowed hard, lowering her gaze. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said shortly, though his voice carried more weariness than anger. "Life takes what it wants." Silence stretched between them, heavy, but not hostile. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low. "I'll move on today. You've done more than I asked." He studied her across the table, the hollow in her cheeks, the stubborn set of her shoulders, the faint tremor in her hands. She was in no shape to keep walking, not yet. "The room's empty now," Elias said after a moment. "If you want another night or two, no charge, just chores, same as anyone else on this ranch." Her head snapped up, eyes wide. She hadn't expected an offer, much less one tied to dignity instead of pity. A room she never expected, a chance she hadn't dared to hope for. And Seraphine Vale, weary and worn, found herself whispering, "Thank you." That night, the hollow was hushed, save for the distant call of a coyote and the whisper of wind threading through the cottonwoods. Inside the ranch house, the fire burned low, casting amber light across the cabin walls. Seraphine slept in the room Elias had cleared for her, his wife's old room, though he hadn't spoken of it again. Elias sat in his chair near the hearth, boots planted firmly on the worn rug, a half-drained cup of coffee cooling in his hand. He told himself it was habit that kept him awake. Ranch work bred men who rose before dawn and often carried through the night. But he knew better. He was listening. Each creak of the house seemed louder tonight. Each shift of the timbers carried weight. The stranger beneath his roof, Seraphine Vale, was quiet now, but her face from supper stayed with him. Not her beauty, though it was plain enough, but the wariness etched into her every movement. She ate like someone used to, snatching food before it was taken away. She sat like someone ready to flee at the sound of footsteps. What had carved that into her? Elias didn't know, and truth be told, he wasn't sure he wanted to. His own past was heavy enough. He didn't invite strangers into his grief. Yet when he'd opened that door to her, dripping rain and desperation, he'd seen something that rooted him to the spot. A soul nearly extinguished, still burning because it refused to give up. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a damp stillness. Elias stirred the fire, the embers sparking like restless thoughts. He should have sent her on her way this morning. That would have been the simpler road. But simplicity hadn't been a companion of his for a long time. His gaze drifted to the closed door down the hall, the one he hadn't touched since Clara died. His wife's memory hung in that space like a ghost. For years, he'd let it sit untouched, a shrine to what he'd lost. Tonight, though, it wasn't grief that filled that hall. It was Seraphine's faint, steady breathing. He leaned back in his chair, setting the empty cup on the side table. The firelight painted hard lines across his face, shadows accentuating the years carved there by sun and sorrow. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, rough with stubble, and let out a breath. "You don't even know her," he muttered to the quiet room. But deep down, He knew enough. Enough to see she wasn't just lost, she was hunted by something, even if she hadn't said it aloud. He'd seen the way her eyes darted to the window at every crack of thunder, the way her hand never strayed far from that satchel she clutched like a lifeline. Elias Cade was not a man who sought company. Yet tonight, he kept watch like a sentry. Not because he owed her anything, not because he expected thanks, but because the woman sleeping in the room he had long kept closed had brought something back into the hollow he thought he'd buried with Clara, an ache that felt dangerously close to hope. And Elias Cade, whether he admitted it or not, was a man who never let his guard down when there was something worth protecting. The sun rose slowly over Raven's Hollow, spilling pale gold across the ridges and breaking through the mist that clung to the valley floor. Elias Cade stepped outside with his coffee, boots sinking into damp earth, and breathed in the sharp scent of pine washed clean by the storm. His ranch stretched wide before him, fence lines glistening with dew, horses moving like shadows in the pasture, the river threading silver through the hollow. It was a morning that usually belonged to him alone, but not today. Behind him, he heard the creak of the porch boards. Seraphine stepped into the light, the blanket from last night draped around her shoulders. Her hair, still damp at the ends, caught the sunlight in copper strands, though her face bore the fatigue of someone who hadn't known real rest in months. "You're up early," Elias said, though his voice carried no surprise. Out here, dawn was the natural hour. She drew the blanket tighter, her eyes scanning the valley with something between awe and hesitation. "It's beautiful, like the storm never happened." Elias tipped his hat slightly, sipping his coffee. "Storms don't last. Valley always outlives them." Her gaze lingered on the horses grazing in the distance. For a moment, the lines of worry smoothed from her face, and Elias caught a glimpse of someone younger, someone who might have laughed once. Then the shadow returned, settling back over her expression. "I should go," she said softly. "I told you one night. You've been kind enough already." Elias set his cup on the porch rail and studied her. He'd heard those words before, in other voices, at other times men drifting through towns, women battered by misfortune, neighbors worn down by drought. Always the same refrain. "I shouldn't ask for more." "You look like you've walked farther than any horse ought to be pushed," he said. "Another day won't break me." She turned to him, searching his face for some hidden motive, but found only the steady calm of a man who meant what he said. Still, her pride bristled. "I can't pay you." Elias shrugged. "Don't need to pay. Ranch has enough work if you want to earn your keep." The suggestion startled her. She'd expected pity, maybe charity, not this. "Work?" He nodded toward the barn. "Stalls don't clean themselves. Fences won't mend. If you're set on repaying me, put your hands to use." Seraphine blinked, then let out a quiet breath that was half relief, half disbelief. "No one's ever offered me that." "Not offering," Elias said plainly. "Just telling you how it is." The corner of her mouth lifted, the faintest hint of a smile, though it faded as quickly as it came. She turned back to the valley, eyes misted. "Maybe one more day then." Elias tipped his hat again, concealing the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. She thought she was staying only a little longer, but he already knew the hollow had a way of keeping those who belonged. And though neither of them would say it, both felt the quiet truth. The storm that brought Seraphine to his door was only the beginning. By mid-morning, the valley had shaken off the storm's weight, and the ranch stirred with the steady rhythm of chores. Elias saddled a bay mare in the barn, while Seraphine lingered at the door, clutching the borrowed blanket around her shoulders like armor. The scent of hay and leather filled the air, mingling with the low whicker of horses. "You don't have to stand there," Elias said without looking up. "Plenty needs doing." Her eyes darted to him, startled. "I told you I don't have money." "And I told you I don't need it." He cinched the saddle tight and straightened, his gaze steady on hers. "You said you wanted to repay me. Work's as good a payment as any." Seraphine hesitated. uncertain whether he was testing her. She had scrubbed floors before, bent her back to strangers' fields, worked until her hands bled just to be turned out without thanks. The idea of working here carried the same fear that she would never be more than a burden passing through. "What kind of work?" she asked carefully. Elias led the mare from the stall and nodded toward the far end of the barn. "Stalls need mucking, grain sacks stacked, tools put back where they belong. It's nothing fancy, just honest work." Her lips pressed together. It was simple labor, but his tone held no condescension, no sharp edge of mockery, only plain expectations. Wordlessly, she set aside the blanket, rolled up her sleeves, and took up a pitchfork leaning against the wall. The wood was rough in her hands, but familiar enough. She stepped into the nearest stall and began shoveling straw, each thrust of the fork steady, deliberate. Elias watched her for a moment before leading the mare outside. Most folks in her condition would have balked, made excuses, or wilted under the weight of the task. But Seraphine moved with a quiet determination, as though she'd been waiting for someone to give her the chance to prove she wasn't helpless. Hours passed in the slow cadence of labor. Dust motes drifted in golden shafts of sunlight, cutting through the barn slats. Sweat darkened the fabric of her dress, and strands of hair slipped loose to cling to her cheeks. But she didn't stop. When Elias returned, he found the stalls cleaned, tools neatly hung, and Seraphine sitting on an overturned bucket, catching her breath. She looked up as he approached, wary as ever, though a spark of pride flickered in her eyes. "Not bad," he said, surveying her work. Most hands wouldn't have lasted half that long on their first day. Her brow lifted, faint surprise breaking through her guardedness. "So I'm not a burden, then?" Elias adjusted his hat, a ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Not today." The words were simple, but they landed heavy in Seraphine's chest. She hadn't been called useful in years. The acknowledgement felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and she found herself clutching it close, afraid it might vanish. For the first time since she'd arrived, she dared to believe she might have more than just one night here. The days slipped by quietly in Raven's Hollow, each one anchored by the rhythm of chores and the muted companionship that had settled between Elias and Seraphine. She rose with the sun, worked beside him without complaint, and retreated to the fire's glow in the evenings, her satchel never far from reach. Yet for all the progress, the cleared stalls, the mended fences, the tentative conversations Elias knew, shadows still clung to her. They weren't the kind that came from sleepless nights or storm clouds. They were deeper, stitched into the way she flinched at sudden noises, the way her eyes scanned the tree line whenever the dogs barked. One evening, as the sky deepened to lavender and the cattle drifted toward water, Elias found her standing by the fence, her hands gripping the rails so tightly her knuckles whitened. She stared out toward the distant trail, as though expecting something or someone to emerge from the horizon. "You're working the wood harder than it deserves," he said, his tone even breaking the silence. Seraphine startled, releasing her grip, then shook her head. "Just thinking." Thinking usually doesn't make a body that tense. Elias leaned on the rail a few feet away, his presence steady but not pressing. "Storm's over, Seraphine. Sky's clear." Her lips parted, then closed again. She glanced down, brushing at the splinters in her palm. Finally she spoke, voice low. "Storms don't always stay in the sky." Elias let her words hang in the quiet. He didn't push. He'd learned long ago that pressing a wound only drove the hurt deeper. Instead, he turned his gaze to the valley, letting her know she wasn't alone but free to hold her silence. After a long moment, she asked, "Have you ever tried to outrun something? No matter how far you go, it keeps finding you?" His jaw tightened. He thought of Clara, of the fever that had stolen her, despite every doctor's promise. "Yeah," he said at last, "I've known something like that." Seraphine's eyes flicked to him, searching for judgment. Finding none, her shoulders eased a fraction, though the shadows in her gaze remained. "Then you understand." Before Elias could reply, a crack echoed through the valley sharp, like a branch snapping under weight. Seraphine stiffened, eyes wide, breath catching. Elias turned sharply toward the tree line, his hand instinctively brushing the butt of the Colt on his hip. Nothing moved but the wind swaying the pines. "You expecting company?" he asked, his voice quiet but edged. "No," she whispered, though the tremor in her tone betrayed fear that company might come anyway. Elias studied her, the truth dawning in fragments. Whoever Seraphine was running from hadn't been left behind in that storm. They were out there still, lingering like thunder beyond the ridges. He turned back to the fading light, his jaw set. Whatever ghosts trailed her, Elias Cade had already made a silent decision. If those shadows crossed his land, they wouldn't find her unprotected. The next morning dawned crisp, the air scented with wet earth and pine sap. Elias had already been up before daylight, checking the north fence where cattle sometimes wandered too close to the ravine. By the time he returned, Seraphine was in the barn, sleeves rolled, pitchfork in hand. She worked with a determination that would have impressed any ranch hand, though Elias noticed the way she kept glancing toward the hills, as if expecting eyes upon her. Midway through the morning, the peace fractured. A sharp whinny split the air, followed by the frantic pounding of hooves. One of the younger colts had spooked, rearing in its pen and slamming against the rails. Elias dropped his tools, striding quickly across the yard. But before he could reach the gate, Seraphine was already there. She moved without hesitation, slipping into the corral, though the colt's panic sent dust flying in clouds. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice steady despite the danger. "Easy now." Elias cursed under his breath. A frightened horse could crush her without a thought. He climbed over the rail, ready to pull her back, but something in her tone gave him pause. Seraphine stood her ground as the colt wheeled toward her, muscles taut beneath its hide. She didn't lunge or grab, she simply lifted her hand, palm open, her words low and rhythmic like a lullaby. "No one's here to hurt you. Just breathe." The colt snorted, pawing the ground, but its wild eyes slowly fixed on hers. Step by step, the animal edged closer, until its flaring nostrils brushed her palm. Seraphine stroked its muzzle gently, her voice softening further. "That's it. You're all right now." Elias, frozen at the rail, watched as the colt's trembling eased, its head lowering at last. Dust settled around them, and for the first time in days, he saw Seraphine without fear in her eyes, only calm, quiet, strength. She glanced back then, as if suddenly remembering she wasn't alone. "Sorry," she said, almost sheepish. "I didn't mean to overstep." Elias climbed down slowly, his boots crunching against the dirt. "You didn't overstep," he said, his voice carrying more weight than he intended. "You just kept that colt from breaking its neck or mine." Color rose faintly in her cheeks, though her gaze dropped to the ground. "I grew up around horses. Guess some things stick." Elias studied her for a moment, noting the steadiness of her hands, the surety in her movements. This wasn't just a chance. Whatever her past, it had left her with skills he hadn't expected. Skills that spoke of someone used to surviving, to calming storms no one else could touch. "You're full of surprises, Seraphine Vale," he said finally, adjusting his hat. She gave the smallest shrug, though her lips curved with the faintest trace of a smile. For the first time since stepping across his threshold, trust sparked between them, tentative, fragile, but real. And Elias Cade, who had sworn his hollow would never hold another soul, felt the first crack in the walls he'd built around his heart. 3 days later, Elias hitched the wagon for a supply run into Prospector's Bend, the nearest town. Seraphine hesitated when he offered her a seat beside him. The thought of leaving the hollow and stepping into a place where curious eyes waited tightened her chest, yet something steadier urged her forward. She climbed onto the bench, clutching her satchel like a shield. The ride in was quiet, the road winding through tall pines before opening into the wide basin where the town sat, a scattering of buildings around a dusty main street. Prospector's Bend wasn't large, but its people had a way of knowing things, or thinking they did. As the wagon rattled down the street, heads turned. Men leaning on hitching rails, women with baskets on their arms, even children playing marbles in the dust, all paused to watch Elias Cade with a stranger at his side. Seraphine lowered her gaze, wishing the earth might swallow her whole. She could hear the whispers rise, like wind behind her back. Who's she? Don't recall seeing her before. Cade's been alone for nearly 5 years. Now look at him. They stopped at the general store, and Elias hopped down first, extending a hand to help her. Seraphine hesitated, then accepted, her cheeks warming at the simple courtesy. Inside, the smell of flour and tobacco mingled with the sharp tang of kerosene. Mr. Caro, the storekeeper, greeted Elias with a nod, then turned his shrewd gaze on Seraphine. "Morning," Elias said evenly, setting a list on the counter. Caro's eyes lingered on the satchel, clutched to Seraphine's side. And who might this be? Elias didn't flinch. This is Seraphine Vale. She's staying on at the ranch for a while. A silence heavier than any thunderstorm filled the store. Caro's brows arched, though he said nothing further. Seraphine felt every second stretch, her throat tightening as she braced for the questions she'd heard all her life. Where she came from, what she'd done, why she didn't belong. But Elias didn't offer explanations, and Caro, seeing something in the cowboy's steady gaze, wisely held his tongue. By the time they stepped back into the sunlight, whispers had spread faster than wildfire. Faces followed them down the boardwalk, some curious, some disapproving. One woman muttered loud enough for Seraphine to hear, "Strays never bring anything but trouble." Seraphine's breath caught, shame burning hot behind her eyes. She quickened her pace, desperate to reach the wagon. But Elias stopped mid-stride, turning toward the voices with the deliberate calm of a man who did not bluff. His words were measured, carrying clear down the street. "Any trouble Seraphine brings will go through me first." The town went still. The woman's face reddened. She turned away without another word. Slowly, conversations resumed, though the stares never fully left. Back in the wagon, Seraphine sat rigid, her heart pounding. Elias climbed up beside her, taking the reins without a glance at the crowd. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes, I did." The horses started forward, leaving Prospector's Bend behind. And though judgment still lingered like smoke in the air, for the first time in years, Seraphine felt what it was to be defended not as a burden, but as someone worth standing beside. The ride home from Prospector's Bend was quiet, but the silence was thick, brimming with words Seraphine couldn't force past her lips. The echo of whispers clung to her, and though Elias had deflected them with his steady defiance, shame gnawed at her ribs like a restless animal. That evening, after the chores were done and the animals settled, Elias stoked the fire high against the chill creeping through the hollow. Seraphine sat near the hearth, the satchel resting against her knees as always. She had never let it leave her reach, not once since the stormy night she arrived. Elias poured 2 mugs of coffee, setting one on the table near her. He leaned against the mantel, watching the flames throw shadows across the walls. "Town'll talk," he said at last. "Always does. You'll drive yourself mad if you try to change it." Her hands tightened around the satchel strap. "I don't need them to like me. Her voice faltered. "I can't bear being called what I already know I am." Elias's eyes narrowed. "And what's that supposed to mean?" She drew in a trembling breath, firelight glinting off the tears she fought to hold back. "A burden. A mistake. A woman nobody wanted." Her words landed like a blade. Elias didn't move, didn't speak, only waited. And in his silence, Seraphine's resolve cracked. She opened the satchel slowly, as though unburdening a piece of her soul. Inside lay only a few possessions: a worn shawl, a leather-bound Bible, and a folded letter, its edges frayed from being opened too many times. She smoothed it across her lap, her hands trembling. "My husband left me this," she whispered. "Left me a promise of a new start. Said he'd send for me once he got steady work out west." Weeks turned into months. The letters stopped. When I went looking, I found him with another woman, a family he'd made without me. I wasn't a wife anymore, just baggage he wanted gone. The fire popped, throwing sparks into the chimney. Seraphine's breath came uneven. Her gaze locked on the letter, as though it might burn if she let go. I walked away with nothing but this bag. Every door I knocked on since has been the same polite refusals, pitying looks, sometimes worse. By the time I reached this valley, I'd stopped hoping anyone would open a door at all. Her voice broke then, the words tumbling out raw. "That's why I asked for just one night. One night was safer than hoping for more." Elias set his cup aside, his face unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the fire. Then he stepped closer, his voice quiet but certain. "You're not a burden, Seraphine Vale, and you're sure as hell not a mistake." She lifted her gaze to his, searching for doubt, but found only the steady weight of truth. The tears finally fell, and for the first time in years, she let them. The firelight caught her brokenness, but it also revealed something else, a flicker of trust, fragile but alive. Burning as stubbornly as the hollow's flame, the fire had burned low, settling into a bed of glowing embers. Seraphine sat curled in the old rocker, her tear-streaked face turned toward the flames, while Elias stood by the mantel, arms crossed over his broad chest. Neither spoke for a long while. The silence wasn't heavy this time, it was something gentler, as though words might cheapen what had already been laid bare. Finally, Elias drew in a slow breath. "You think you're the only one who's lost?" His voice was low, almost gravelly. "You think you're the only one who's been left behind?" Seraphine looked up, her eyes rimmed red. Elias's gaze drifted to the closed door down the hall, the one he hadn't touched since the day the fever took Clara. "My wife was the kind of woman who lit up a room without trying. Stronger than me, if I'm honest. We had plans, children, a bigger herd, a life carved out together. But fever doesn't care about plans. Came like a thief in the night, and within a week, she was gone." His jaw tightened as he continued, his voice steady though laced with sorrow. "I buried her beneath the cottonwoods out back. After that, I swore off letting anyone close. Figured if I kept this place quiet, if I filled the days with work, maybe the hollow inside me wouldn't echo so loud." Seraphine's fingers tightened around the frayed letter in her lap. "And did it help?" Elias gave a humorless chuckle. "Depends on the day. Most days, it felt like I was just waiting out the years, not really living them." His eyes shifted back to hers, steady as steel. "Then you knocked on my door." She blinked, startled. "I never meant to." "You don't have to explain," Elias said, his tone softening. "Point is, I thought I was done carrying anyone's weight. Thought I'd locked every door worth opening. But watching you fight to hold yourself together, seeing you work with your hands when most would have given up, made me realize maybe I wasn't done after all." Seraphine's breath caught. She tried to look away, but his words held her, steady as the valley wind. "I can't promise life won't cut you again," Elias said, his voice deepening. "But I can promise this. As long as you're under my roof, you'll never be turned away. Not for one night. Not for any night. You wanted shelter, well, you've got it, for as long as you'll take it." Her lips parted, trembling with the weight of something she couldn't name. No one had ever vowed such a thing to her, not with sincerity, not with the quiet conviction that rolled like thunder in his voice. Tears welled again, but this time they weren't born of shame. They were born of something far rarer, hope. Elias didn't reach for her, didn't crowd her with touch. He only stood there, a sentinel of flesh and bone, the firelight etching the vow onto his weathered face. And in the quiet between them, Seraphine realized she'd come seeking one night of shelter, but what this cowboy had just offered her was far more dangerous and far more precious. A lifetime. The hollow had changed. Where silence once ruled, There was now the rhythm of two voices, two lives slowly weaving together. Seraphine no longer clutched her satchel as if it were armor. She set it aside each night, trusting the cabin's walls to keep her safe. One evening, Elias brought out a chestnut mare and pressed the reins into her hands. "Ever ride?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "It's been years." Together they crossed the valley at sunset, the wind in their hair, the sound of laughter breaking from Seraphine's lips like something long buried. Elias turned at the sound, warmth flickering in his eyes. Later, as they stood on the porch beneath the stars, she whispered, "What if I'm not strong enough? What if I bring nothing but trouble?" Elias's gaze was steady. "You've already proven stronger than you know. And if trouble comes, it'll go through me first." Her eyes shimmered, the doubt in them softening. The woman who had asked for one night of shelter realized the cowboy beside her had given her far more than safety. Seraphine Vale had found home, and Elias Cade had offered her a lifetime. If you thought these were crazy, you won't want to miss what happens in this next video.